Blood in the Rain. Chapter 1. The Kingdom Nightclub, London. 10 p.m. The 3 floors of the club's central room were buzzing with life. A dark light hung over the proceedings, and the strobe lights strafed the room, making people appear as if they were moving in slow motion. The music pumped, which seemed to almost dance through the air like a living organism moving with its insatiable beat, swallowing up all who came into contact with it, infecting them with the rhythm. The sound was so loud as to make your eardrums literally shake with vibration, and your head feel as if the only thing in the world was the beat. Beautiful women danced with beautiful men on the floor, and all things were illuminated only by a purple deep light, which seemed to turn all things it touched into a deep shade of violet. The VIP area bristled with lively conversation between suited men and bedressed women in dark black uniforms as they were entertained by the famous dancers of the Kingdom Club. So famous indeed that they had been seen for decades as the pinnacle of the adult dancing world, where one could make £2,000 in a few hours' work. And around them security guards walked slowly around the building, and on the top floor those whom had come from a rest from the hectic dancing below were treated to a room awash with blue calm light. A smaller, fully staffed bar, and the conversations of those aiming to leave within the hour were all that could be found there. On the railings overlooking the main dance floor, tired couples and friends looked out for their mates down on the dance floor below. Towards the back were several other rooms catering to different types of musical taste, from grime all the way to hardcore techno. The club truly was a kingdom in all intents and purposes. It had its own provinces, governing systems and armies belonging to each of the 5 sub-managers, all working under the big boss. The big boss was a man who needed no introduction on the London nightlife scene when he had bought the club some 15 years ago. His name was Phillip Morgan. Morgan had built his fortune in Ibiza, Alicante, Malaga and Magaluf, building cheap nightclubs with migrant labour. It had been a fortune which had kept him going quite nicely, allowing him to enter the world of music producing in the 2000s, a decision which had then propelled him into fame. He'd been on the cover of GQ, been mentioned in news reports about the industry, sat on Newsnight, Have I Got News for You, and the Daily Politics, and he had become the face of the nighttime economy in the United Kingdom. His name was so powerful that with it behind you, you were guaranteed to propel yourself to unimaginable riches. But for a man so famous and so rich as he was, he lacked the ability to say no, especially to friends. And so when 5 years ago his shadowy friend from the world of national security approached him for a meeting place, he could hardly say no. His friend had, after all, saved him from prison in Spain. 6 years ago he had been caught with a prostitute in a big scandal involving underage girls in his La Crocodilo club in Malaga. It had been a scandal which had also led to him becoming involved in Spain's unpredictable underworld. He had soon found himself out of his depth in a spiralling nightmare of criminals, corrupt politicians and violent policemen. It had been in the midst of this crisis that he had met this shadowy individual. The man had been a regular at Philip's most famous Spanish bar, and in fact had been the man to approach him. Within a week, the problem had been sorted, but Philip was warned that then and there that there would be a price to pay later on, and a year later that price had come. 5 years on, it was a price that he was still paying. Philip sat in his office staring at the white walls, thinking in his own circular thought pattern about the decisions that he had made back then. After all, he had actually been innocent of the charges in Spain. It had been his subordinates who had begun to allow prostitution and pornography onto the premises, let alone narcotics. But that story would have never passed with the papers. It was something which infuriated him. He had become senile and too trusting, and he knew it. But inviting that shadow into his life was even more infuriating. He began to think about the next room. The deals being done next door, deals which he was never a part of, and it had begun to feel like it was no longer his club. These shadowy men next door to his office met once a week. Free drinks, free girls, free everything. The only thing that wasn't free was Mr. Morgan. Yet he was now 76 and nearing the end of his life anyway, and he contemplated in silence, secretly wishing that the end would come quicker. He felt as if he was a mighty lion who had been reduced to a rabbit, shut in his cage, only brought out for a stroke and a bit of fun. Only dragged into the limelight to tell stories of the past, to reminisce and to be laughed at. From his current position, it was hard to remember the man he had once been. He picked up a photograph from the desk. His large fingers had almost grown around his wedding ring, which he refused to take off since the death of his wife. He stroked her face within the portrait. As he stared at it, he began to wish she was still here with him. She had been his sweetheart since he was just 14 years old, and her death had been the beginning of all the awful things that had occurred in his kingdom over the past 5 years. He looked at his daughter, who worked diligently opposite him at her desk. Her computer, full of spreadsheets, was buzzing and lit up the room where she was working. In reality, she had been a godsend, joining the staff only last year. She had abandoned everything to work with him. She'd always said, though, that she didn't mind giving up university to help out her old father, but deep down he knew that to some extent she resented him for it. The room filled with a melancholy atmosphere, as he began to exude the negative energy of regret and loss, which filled the room quickly, creating a heavy air about the place. He was very suddenly woken out of his stupor by the sounds of agitated shouting next door. He arose from his seat, his large frame making it difficult to rise fast. Walking with a slight stoop, he plodded over to the frosted glass door, which separated the two rooms. He motioned his daughter to stay where she was. He didn't want her to see what might be going on the other side. He had tried to keep her away from the less clean activities of the establishment, but this time her witnessing them might have become unavoidable. Closing his eyes, he opened the door. He closed it quickly behind him, and he looked upon the scene. 4 men sat looking at the 2 men in the centre, who were stood up and squaring off to each other. In the middle of the scene was a low glass table. Upon it was a huge and very detailed map of London, a map which was obscured by the low lighting of the room. The company girls, who Philip had sent to entertain these men, were sat in the booth in the right corner, standing and staring at the commotion which had been caused. He knew who these men were, and it broke his heart every time he saw them here. He knew all of their dirty secrets. He knew how dirty these men really were. Yet he was powerless. And so he said in an almost whimper, Is everything okay in here?" The one who had been causing the most commotion turned to face him. His name was Sam Price, or to give him his proper title, Detective Inspector Sam Price. He was a terrifying Goliath of a man, standing at 6 foot 8 inches and a 48-inch chest. For 20 years he had been in Greater Manchester's gang crime squad, smashing the heads of street thugs and petty gangbangers, but upon joining the Met, he had immediately fallen in with the crowd which now gathered every week in this room. A crowd which, despite its profitable opportunities, was nonetheless dangerous and unpredictable. Philip could tell that he was in one of his infamous rages. Sam's perfectly square head bulged. The veins in his forehead vibrated, and his orange tobacco-stained teeth glinted in the low light. His famously furious eyes were now looking directly at Philip. These eyes, which at peace were blue, immediately seemed to burn in an inferno at the point of anger. To look into those eyes while he was like this was to merely see fire, vengeance, and the sheer sword of the law that he once served. But now that same fire, vengeance, served his own law, and there was nothing hidden or secret about Sam Price. He hated everything which did not reside within what he was prepared to tolerate. There was no moderation, only extremes. He drank to extremes, danced to extremes, fought to extremes, loved to extremes. The only time Philip had ever seen him calm and almost sane was those times where the dancers danced for him, or where, when heavily medicated by painkillers, he had just sat there at rest. All knew what this man was capable of, and his position as the key enforcer of the organisation that these men belonged to. No man knew that more than Philip, who began to apologise when another one of the four men got up to interject in the situation. The second man of the four was a slightly shadier man by the name of David. The surname had never been mentioned, but Philip had watched him. David was no policeman. He had never shown a badge, never bragged about service, never talked about catching criminals. In fact, he had never said anything about his life at all. His concern was money, and that he constantly exercised whenever these meetings had been called. David was always immensely calm. He never rose his voice, ever, a most disconcerting feature in comparison to his company. He was careful and calculated, and in meetings Philip had always observed his ability to say absolutely nothing until the correct and ultimately planned interjection. He was also fairly sure that David was far closer to their big boss than the others, a boss whom he knew resided somewhere in Britain's labyrinthine national security power structure. David was almost entirely bald, except for some grey hairs at the back of his head. He was older than the others, and possessed round-rimmed glasses which he always took off and polished when emphasizing a particular point. He was thin to the point of absurdity, and at a mere 5'8" he was the smallest man in the group. But he was inevitably the most sinister. He was brutally sadistic with the actions he committed, and his acts were frequently a cause for great disagreement between Sam and himself. For all Philip knew, this might be one of those occasions. It was also to Philip's shame that David was permitted to roam the club looking for women which he would then kidnap, and whom were often found dead days later, or unable to remember the night before. Philip was powerless to stop David. Too integral was he to the system that these four men served. But he tried his best to keep David away from the serving girls and the dancers by never permitting more than 2 girls to keep them company at any one time. But David was a true predator, and there had been a few incidents which Philip was aware of. However much he hated David, though, he was now thankful for his interruption of Sam, who knew that it would be impossible to harm Philip. For although none of them cared whether he lived or died, they did care for the opinion of their boss. Sam turned to David with his terrifying air of potential violence, clenched his teeth, and then sat back down. Philip was relieved, and looked over to the bar which he had left them in the room with, and saw the third member of the gang of horsemen. The third member of the group was DCI Jack Bradley. In real life he was head of Essex Police's Vice and Clubs unit, and on the surface of it he was the most legitimate of the men gathered here, and indeed the most jovial. He was built like a brick, just a rectangle which went straight downwards. A powerful chest pumped out from his shirt, and when here and off duty, a silver chain hung from his neck. He had a permanent light tan and deep stress lines around his forehead. His eyes, like Sam's, were a bright blue, But unlike Sam's, his were beacons of warmth and charm. All you saw within this man was goodness and a fun time. Below his eyes he had great rosy red cheeks, which made him look almost childlike when he smiled, which was frequently. He had never seen him angry, but whenever stressed he would brush back his jet black hair away from his face and rub his temples. Truth be told, Philip had always found his company delightful when they had been caught alone together. He was always telling stories to barmaids about when he visited such and such or arrested who and who. He was a hard drinker, at least in Philip's opinion, maybe on the verge of a serious addiction. But this did, however, fuel profits of the Kingdom Club greatly, and so Philip never mentioned anything about it. Unlike the others, Jack Bradley paid up his bill in full and on time, and he was in incredible contrast to Sam. Philip found it hard to believe that they actually got on behind the scenes, but according to the small talk he overheard, it was indeed Sam and Jack who got on the best. Jack was liked by everyone, and everything he touched turned into something influenced by him. When he walked, he seemed to carry an aura around him, but it was this influence he wielded which was his inner darkness. A darkness which he never revealed. Unlike the exterior deep darkness of Sam, his darkness was a quiet thing. Like a thief in the night, he would steal your heart and your mind, permanently delivering you into his orbit. Manipulation ran through Jack's brain, like blood through the veins. Although Sam might beat you till you did his bidding, Jack would simply collect you, and once your heart and head belonged to him, you were finished. As Philip looked at him, so Jack looked back, giving a jovial toast with a glass of whisky which he had just poured. That left only one man in the four, a last man standing, a man who now gazed with contempt at Sam. This man's name was Peter Stanmore. Stanmore was cold, official almost. He would chastise the other three for calling him Peter, and always corrected them with a "Mr. Stanmore, please." Stanmore was no criminal, nor was he especially corrupt. Philip had never actually worked out his motivations for being within this little club of dirty men, but he was always immaculately dressed, and he never looked as if he had ever been involved in dirty activity. He even looked as if he probably had clean sex, and his face never rose a smile, but was perpetually within a detached, arrogant, nosy look. A look to put across the difference which he felt between him and the others. Mr. Stanmore, Philip had long ago deduced, did not work for the police, but was in fact a spook who viewed himself as merely doing his job. He never raised a fist like Sam, never came into the club after work like Jack, never sought to exercise sexual favours like those David forced upon serving girls. No, instead he merely came and then left. He never spoke unless it was important, and the only feeling which Philip got from him was the undeniable sense that he didn't want to be there. Maybe even that there was a power behind Peter that trumped the immense political power that seemed to be behind David, but Philip could not be sure. To look at these men and assume that those who shouted the loudest were the most powerful would be the biggest mistake of all. For the power structure that they belonged to was complex, efficient, and without the need of mavericks and loose cannons. And as Philip stood in the door, contemplating his next move to calm down the men, he heard footsteps. Unmistakably loud footsteps. He turned around and saw the final piece of the jigsaw, the power that lay behind the four men, but not at the top of the tree. He was indeed their superior in every way, and where each of them made up a singular powerful whole as a group. This man was the whole. He needed no power to back him, although he answered to others. And it was this man who had in 1 week fixed, removed, or eliminated everyone involved in the Spanish scandal. The man was Philip's one-time close friend, and now pollutant enemy, that now marched those corridors. And it was this man who, with one click of his fingers, could have all of these men face down in a ditch off some minor motorway by the time he'd finished his breakfast. The man walked down the hallway, which was lit up by aggressive dark red lighting. His normally pale face was illuminated only by the said red lights, and his almost perfect features cut through the atmospherics. His nose was straight and featureless. His eyes were a perfect distance apart and pitch black, and his hair was as black as his eyes. His hair shone as the light reflected off it, back away into the light bulb, almost as if the light itself was scared to come out to this man of such power and magnitude. His black tie remained almost perfectly straight, even as he walked, and his high, vampiric cheekbones cut effortlessly through the air. As he completed the tunnel, his face came into the light. It was pale, so pale as to be like the colour of snow, and his eyes were blacker than Philip had remembered last time. Philip felt as if this man was staring into his soul. The 4 men had stopped arguing now entirely. They sat in silence. The 2 girls in the room didn't know what to do, and dared not move. Without even speaking to Philip, the man went into the room, pulled out a chair in the corner, sat down, and motioned one of the girls to bring him a drink. He looked down at his silver watch, looked for a second, and then opened his mouth. "Sit down, all of you, before you make me raise my voice. Samuel, would you care to detail why I have had to arrive at this meeting with your anger tainting my ears?" Sam looked at him, unwilling to speak. His normal obvious hatred muted for reasons of self-preservation. He was limited to merely moving his fingers rapidly as he spoke. "No, I've got no excuse for raising my voice. I am very, very sorry." "Good. Any problems you have with our little perverted friend here can be ironed out at a later date. As you are aware, you are here so that we can commence the annual carving up of territory. Reassemblance, stitching together, distribution of gangs, money flow, properties, etc., etc. So you know how the process works. I will sit here, and you gentlemen, will bid for the territories. Now, I've already spoken to our units in Manchester, Liverpool and Birmingham, Glasgow and Ireland, and they've carved up their territories. So London, i.e. the most protected property on the map, is now up for sale. If you'd like to sit down, then we'll begin." They all took their seats, and one of the serving girls was pressed into service to hold the map up, while the other held the other end. The new man came and stood in the middle, and drew a sharp, straight-edged razor from his pocket. The men, all sitting in silence, looked intently, waiting for him to begin speaking. "First up, we have the most profitable part of the city, for our purposes at least, East London. In East London, we have almost 100 youth gangs. We have every ethnic organisation you can imagine. We have a whole plethora of strip joints, brothels, illegal arms factories, drug manufacturing facilities, and drug distribution rings. We also have a whole army of people who consume, from fucking stoned up hippies trying to gentrify the area, all the way down to poor people just off of the boat. I start the bidding at 50. For years, Philip had observed these auctions from his kingdom. He never quite understood them. He had to admit now, but he had always assumed that the bids were based on how many men the people could supply in order to secure their new fiefdoms. He was always curious about the process, but he had never asked his friend now sat in the centre dictating the bids. As he watched it, it appeared that they were now in a fierce bidding war for this territory. Jack was the only man with any leeway, and it appeared that he was going to win. Until, from the corner, they heard the unmistakable sound of David, who had not yet said a word. "I bid 800 men-at-arms." "Bollocks! Where are you going to get 800 men-at-arms?" Jack was incredulous, and then something which he had never seen happen before happened. Sam put up his card and offered to share the territory with Jack. Together they had already bid 500 each. There was a slight pause, but Dave didn't give it a reply. Instead, he faded back into the background. But it was very unusual, to be sure. Not that it seemed to matter to their erstwhile auctioneer. But as the auction continued and the men bartered away entire quarters of the world-famous city, a much darker story was developing elsewhere. End of chapter 1.